The metal of the 1998 Volvo station wagon didn't just keep the cold out, it seemed to hoard it. At 75, her bones had become reliable barometers for the harsh northeastern winter, aching long before the first snowflake drifted past the fogged-up windows. She sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in layers of mismatched thrift store blankets, her breath rising in frail, translucent plumes. Outside, the city was changing, bursting with sleek glass high-rises and trendy bistros that made their battered vehicle look like a ghost parked in the shadows of progress. They were invisible to the affluent passers-by, yet painfully exposed to the shifting local ordinances that criminalized their poverty. Behind the wheel sat her son. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror with the hypervigilance of a man who had assumed the role of both provider and shield. He was 42, though the deep lines etched around his eyes made him look older. He had given up his own pride months ago, dedicating every waking hour to keeping her warm, well-fed, and safe from the volatile whims of the streets. When the engine coughed and died an hour ago, cutting off the meager sanctuary of the car's heater, he didn't complain. Instead, he quietly draped his own heavy flannel jacket over her shoulders, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his exhausted eyes. Their existence was measured in small, grueling victories: finding a well-lit parking spot that wouldn't attract the police, stretching a single fast food meal between them, and surviving another freezing night. She watched his profile, her heart heavy with a mother's quiet guilt. She had lived a long life, but this wasn't the legacy she ever intended to pass down to him. They were drowning in the margins of a society that had no room for the old or the displaced. The sharp, rhythmic rap on the driver's side window shattered the freezing silence. He flinched, his hand instinctively dropping to lock the door, his body positioning itself defensively in front of her. But the face peering through the frost wasn't a police officer or an aggressive vagrant. It was a young woman with wind-chapped cheeks, wearing a professional wool coat and carrying a thick, weather-torn manila envelope tucked tightly under her arm. He cracked the window just an inch, the biting wind rushing inside. The woman introduced herself as a legal aid attorney, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. She had been searching for them across 3 different shelters and legal clinics for nearly 3 weeks. When the attorney slipped the heavy envelope through the gap, she handed over a piece of history that defied comprehension. Inside the envelope lay a stack of yellowed, brittle documents stamped with a federal seal from 1945. The attorney explained the impossible reality. She was the sole living heir to an estate that had been locked away in a legal vacuum for over 80 years. Her grandfather, a brilliant and reclusive man who had vanished without a trace in the turbulent wake of World War II, had not left them destitute. He had left a deed. Deep within the rugged, isolated ridges of the Appalachian Mountains sat a private tract of land, housing a sturdy timber cabin. According to a highly unusual ironclad clause written into the original 1945 estate filing, the property was to be legally sealed, untouched, and barred from any public or private sale for exactly 8 decades. The state had protected it, locked in time, waiting for a specific date that had just passed. She stared at the elegant, faded cursive of her grandfather's signature on the deed. For decades, her family had believed he simply abandoned them, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a legacy of sudden poverty. Now, holding the heavy papers in her trembling, arthritic hands, she felt the first stirrings of a forgotten truth. The cabin was theirs. It was a tangible piece of land, a roof that didn't run on gasoline, and a fortress against the bitter cold. He looked over at her, the reflection of the streetlights catching the sudden, fierce spark of hope in his eyes. The city around them was still freezing, but for the first time in years, the road ahead of them didn't lead to another dead end. The worn gears of the Volvo groaned as he shifted into a lower drive, pushing the station wagon up the initial incline of the Appalachian foothills. Behind them lay the city, its neon glow fading into a gray smudge against the winter horizon. To afford the trek, he had emptied their crumpled reserves, every last dollar bill and handful of loose change scraped from the glove compartment, to fill the tank to its brim and buy 2 stale thermoses of black coffee. It was a reckless gamble, a literal burning of bridges, leaving them with nothing but a half tank of fuel and a map scrawled on the back of a legal aid flyer. If the cabin was a myth or a ruin, there would be no turning back. As the highway dwindled from 4 paved lanes to a fractured, 2-lane state road, the modern world began to peel away. The aggressive hum of highway traffic was replaced by the eerie, rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath tires and the whistling sigh of the mountain wind. Billboards and fast food arches vanished, replaced by towering, skeletal pines and jagged rock faces that seemed to lean over the road like ancient sentinels. The air inside the car changed too, losing the chemical taint of exhaust and city smog, turning sharp, pine-scented, and so bitterly cold that their breath blossomed into thick, constant clouds. He kept his hands steady on the rattling wheel, his eyes locked on the treacherous, unplowed road ahead as the elevation climbed higher into the clouds. In the passenger seat, she watched the wilderness swallow them whole. The rhythmic swaying of the car coaxed old, buried fragments of memory from the fog of her childhood. She had been so young when her grandfather disappeared, a mere child of 5, yet certain impressions remained indelible. She remembered the smell of his heavy wool coats, a distinct mixture of pipe tobacco, ozone, and machine oil. He hadn't been like other grandfathers. He didn't tell fairy tales or play parlor games. He was a creature of blueprints, brass instruments, and low-humming vacuum tubes, always retreating into a locked basement workshop where the family was strictly forbidden to enter. She remembered the sudden, frantic shift in his demeanor during the final months of the war. The brilliant, soft-spoken engineer had grown paranoid, locking his eyes onto the windows at every passing vehicle, his hands trembling as he hastily packed heavy wooden crates in the dead of night. Then, a week before the victory parades in 1945, he was simply gone. The family had been left in a vacuum of confusion and shame, forced to weather the sudden financial ruin and the unspoken whispers that he had been a traitor, a coward, or worse. For 70 years, that silence had been her inheritance. Now, as the car climbed deeper into the forgotten ridges, she wondered if the mountain air held the answers to those decades of obscurity. The road grew progressively worse, reduced to little more than a logging trail choked with fallen branches and patches of black ice. He navigated the steep switchbacks with a grim focus, the engine whining in protest as the tires slipped, gripped, and fought for traction. There were no power lines out here, no cell phone bars at the top of their screens, no signs of human life for miles. They were entering a zone where time had stopped. The late afternoon sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The isolation was absolute, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic noise of the city streets they had fled. Yet, looking out at the vast, untouched wilderness, she didn't feel the sharp edge of fear that usually accompanied the unknown. There was a strange, heavy solemnity to the landscape, as if the mountains themselves were guarding a secret meant only for them. He slowed the car to a crawl, his headlights cutting through the gathering gloom to illuminate a rusted, overgrown iron gate half hidden by a snowdrift. The lock on the gate was gone, decayed by decades of rust, allowing the barrier to sag open just enough for a vehicle to pass. Beyond it, a narrow, unpaved path wound upward into a dense grove of ancient hemlocks. He glanced at her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve, before steering the Volvo through the threshold, driving them directly into the heart of her family's eclipsed past. The tires crunching over decades of accumulated pine needles brought the Volvo to a final shuddering halt. The headlights cut through the descending mountain twilight, illuminating a structure that looked less like a home and more like a natural extension of the rugged terrain. Swallowed by a dense shroud of overgrown briars, encroaching ivy, and ancient towering hemlocks, the heavy timber cabin loomed before them. It sat in a hollow of absolute silence, insulated from the rest of the world by miles of untouched wilderness. Snow clung to the deep-set eaves of the roof, and the dark, weathered logs of the exterior had turned a charcoal gray from 80 years of unforgiving winters. It was a monument to isolation, completely frozen in the exact moment it had been abandoned. He cut the engine, and the sudden absence of the car's mechanical hum felt deafening. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared through the cracked windshield at the structure that was now legally theirs. The air outside was so still it felt sacred, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do. She unbuckled her seatbelt with stiff, deliberate movements, her eyes fixed on the covered porch. The reality of their situation hung heavily between them. They had spent their last dollar to get here, and this wild, silent place was their only remaining sanctuary. He stepped out of the car first, his boots sinking into the virgin snow with a crisp, echoing crunch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, sharp and pure, a far cry from the damp, exhaust-choked chill of the city. Walking around to the passenger side, he opened her door and extended a steady, supportive arm. She leaned into him, her frail frame shivering despite the blankets wrapped around her, but her gaze never wavered from the cabin. Together, they ascended the creaking wooden steps of the porch, their footsteps waking up a floorboard groan that hadn't been heard since the Truman administration. When they reached the front door, the true nature of her grandfather's departure became starkly clear. This was not a cabin that had merely been locked and left behind. It had been fortified. The heavy oak door was reinforced with thick, horizontal iron bars bolted directly into the massive log frames. But the most striking feature was the central locking mechanism. It was a massive, custom-built mechanical deadbolt, intricate and imposing, forged from a heavy alloy that had resisted the worst of the rust. Etched deeply into the center of the brass faceplate was a single, chilling inscription, 1945. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips tracing the cold, engraved numbers. The sheer weight of the defense mechanism spoke of a desperate, consuming paranoia. Her grandfather hadn't just wanted to keep people out. He had wanted to seal whatever was inside away from the changing world. The lock was a mechanical masterpiece, a labyrinth of tumblers and deadbolts that defied any standard key. He examined the ironwork, his brow furrowing as he realized that their journey could end right here on the porch if they couldn't breach the threshold. Without a word, he descended the steps and walked back to the trunk of the Volvo. He returned a moment later carrying a heavy iron tire iron and a rusted but sturdy crowbar, the only tools they possessed. He looked at her, seeking silent permission, and she nodded, her eyes reflecting the dimming amber light of the setting sun. The breach of the cabin became a grueling, coordinated battle against time and metal. He wedged the flat edge of the crowbar beneath the first iron bar, bracing his weight against the frame. The wood groaned in protest, crying out after 8 decades of undisturbed rest. Realizing he needed leverage, she stepped forward, placing her fragile hands over his, adding what little weight and strength her 75-year-old body could muster. It was a profound, silent partnership between mother and son, born from the desperation of the streets and fueled by the promise of a home. With a sharp, violent snap that echoed through the silent valley like a gunshot, the first iron bolt sheared away. He caught his breath, sweat despite the freezing air, and immediately shifted his focus to the central deadbolt. The brass mechanism was stubborn, its internal gears seized by decades of dormancy. He jammed the tire iron into the narrow seam between the door and the frame, applying a slow, agonizing amount of pressure. He strained, the muscles in his back tightening, until the intricate internal tumblers finally shattered under the immense leverage. The heavy oak door drifted open an inch, breaking a vacuum that had existed since the final days of World War II. Instantly, a rush of stale, preservation-cooled air escaped from the dark interior, washing over them like a physical wave. It was an intoxicating, atmospheric draft that carried no hint of decay or rot. Instead, it smelled vividly of aromatic cedar chips, ancient, brittle paper, and the distinct, sharp tang of industrial machine oil. It was the exact scent she had carried in her memories for 70 years, the scent of her grandfather's forbidden workshop. The darkness inside the cabin was total, save for the narrow shafts of twilight cutting through the doorway. He reached into his pocket and pulled out their small plastic flashlight, clicking it on. The thin white beam sliced through the gloom, illuminating a space that defied the passage of time. He took a cautious step over the threshold, keeping himself positioned slightly ahead of her, his boots leaving the very first footprints on a floor covered in a uniform, silver coat of dust. She followed him into the stillness, her breath catching in her throat. The air was cold, yet it lacked the cruel, biting edge of the outdoor wind. As the flashlight beam swept across the room, it revealed a living space that looked as though its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and would return at any second. There was no mold, no evidence of animal intrusion, and no decay. The airtight ceiling of the cabin had acted as a perfect vault, preserving a lost era in pristine clarity. They had finally broken the seal on a forgotten legacy, and the heavy door settled behind them, shutting out the modern world entirely. The thin beam of the flashlight danced across the living room, cutting through a silence so profound it felt heavy. Every surface was coated in a uniform, undisturbed layer of silver dust that glistened like frost under the artificial light. As they moved deeper into the room, the sheer perfection of the preservation became unsettling. On a small wooden sideboard near the doorway sat a half-empty ceramic teacup. The liquid inside had completely evaporated decades ago, leaving behind a dark, crystallized residue that had turned to solid stone, anchoring the spoon to the porcelain basin. It was a stark, haunting reminder of a life interrupted in mid-motion, a domestic moment frozen mid-breath. A few feet away, hanging slightly crooked on the log wall, was a small paper calendar. The edges were yellowed, but the print remained perfectly legible under the layer of dust. August 1945. The small squares of the days were unmarked, stopping abruptly midway through the month, precisely around the time the world changed forever with the drop of the atomic bombs and the sudden end of the war. The cabin was a time capsule, hermetically sealed against the decay of the outside world, holding its breath for exactly 81 years. He didn't let his guard down. While the emotional weight of the space seemed to pull at her, his immediate instinct was survival. He gently patted her shoulder, murmuring a soft reassurance before stepping away to explore the perimeter of the structure. He needed to check the integrity of the windows, ensure no structural collapses were imminent, and find a way to secure the place for the night. His heavy boots made muted, thudding sounds against the thick pine floorboards as he moved toward the back kitchen and the small adjoining bedroom, his flashlight beams sweeping over vintage iron stoves and pristine wool blankets that had never known a moth. Left alone in the center of the main room, she felt a powerful, magnetic pull toward a massive, dark mahogany desk positioned beneath the front window. It was a serious, utilitarian piece of furniture, built to withstand heavy use. Her arthritic fingers brushed across the dust-covered top, leaving deep trails in the silver powder as she pulled out the heavy wooden chair. The wood groaned softly, a welcoming sound that seemed to bridge the vast chasm of time between her childhood and her present reality. On the center of the desk sat a heavy glass inkwell, dry as a bone, and a beautifully crafted fountain pen resting in its groove. Beside it lay a thick leather binder, its brass corners tarnished to a deep patina. With trembling hands, she lifted the cover. Inside was a neatly organized stack of onion skin paper, so thin and fragile it rustled like dry leaves in the quiet cabin. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. The precise, elegant script of her grandfather, the brilliant engineer whose name had been spoken only in hushed, shameful whispers throughout her life. She began to read, her eyes scanning the faded blue ink. These were not scientific notes or cold equations. They were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her grandmother, each one starting with the same deeply affectionate nickname that she hadn't heard since she was a little girl. As she devoured the words, the decades of bitter misunderstanding and family shame began to dissolve, replaced by a suffocating sense of awe. Her grandfather had not run away to escape his responsibilities. He had not abandoned his wife and child out of malice or cowardice. He had fled out of absolute, paralyzing terror, not for his own life, but for theirs. The letters spoke of a dark, escalating pressure in the final months of World War II. Her grandfather had been recruited for a highly classified project, working on advanced technologies that he believed were crossing a dangerous ethical line. He wrote about men in dark suits watching their suburban home, about veiled threats made against his young daughter, her mother, and about the terrifying realization that his secret research had made him a permanent target. He realized that as long as he was with his family, they would never be safe. The government, or perhaps forces even more ruthless, would use his loved ones as leverage to control his mind and his inventions. If they think I am dead, or that I have betrayed them and fled the country, they will leave you alone, one letter read. The ink slightly blurred as if a tear had fallen on the page before it dried. I am sealing everything here. I am burying the truth where they cannot find it, and I am running into the dark so that you and our little girl can walk in the light. Do not hate me, my love. Everything I do, I do to keep the monsters away from our door." A tear slipped down her own weathered cheek, cutting a clean path through the dust that had settled on her face. For her entire adult life she had carried the phantom weight of a broken family, believing her lineage was rooted in desertion. To discover that his disappearance was actually a supreme act of agonizing love and self-sacrifice was a revelation that shook her to her very core. He had condemned himself to a life of isolation and anonymity just to ensure that his family could survive. From the back of the cabin, the heavy, rhythmic thudding of her son's footsteps returned. He walked back into the main room, his face smudged with soot but bearing a look of cautious relief. He reported that the back window shutters were iron-reinforced and completely intact, the roof was solid, and there was a substantial stack of dry, seasoned oak firewood stored in a side alcove that had somehow remained perfectly preserved. They had shelter, and they had a way to fight off the freezing night. But when he looked at her, he stopped in his tracks. He saw the open binder, the fragile yellowed papers, and the profound, transformative emotion written across his mother's 75-year-old face. He dropped his tools onto a nearby bench and hurried to her side, placing a warm, protective hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of grief and fierce pride. She didn't say a word at first. Instead, she simply reached up, took his calloused hand, and guided it down to the fragile onion skin paper, pointing to the final paragraph of the last letter. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he read the desperate, loving words of a great-grandfather he had never known, a man who had sacrificed everything to guarantee the future of the family that was currently shivering in the Appalachian wilderness. The mystery of their past was unfolding, and the true weight of their inheritance was just beginning to reveal itself. The emotional revelation of the letters still hung heavily in the air as he turned his attention to their immediate survival. The mountain temperature was plummeting rapidly, and the ambient chill inside the cabin was growing sharp enough to sting. He moved toward the massive stone hearth that dominated the far wall, determined to build a fire with the dry oak logs he had found. Kneeling before the blackened fireplace, he peered upward into the flue, only to find it completely blocked by an intentional, tightly packed plug of mortar and stone, yet another defensive measure to seal the cabin completely from the outside world. Frustrated, he began to clear the debris around the hearth to get better leverage. He grabbed the edge of a stiff, dust-choked wool rug that lay dead center in the living room, intending to drag it out of the way. As the heavy textile bunched up under his strain, the rough fibers scraped against something unyielding. He stopped, kicking away the remaining crust of dirt and fabric. Beneath the rug lay a massive, flush-mounted wooden panel inset directly into the thick pine floorboards. Bound by heavy iron straps, the panel featured a recessed, heavy iron ring meant for lifting. But it was the locking mechanism that made him call out softly to her. Embedded in the center of the trapdoor was an exact, miniature replica of the intricate brass deadbolt they had just breached on the front porch. The same interlocking mechanical gears, the same masterfully forged alloy, and the same unmistakable aesthetic of her grandfather's genius. This wasn't a standard cellar door. It was a secure hatch, designed by an engineer who specialized in keeping secrets buried. She rose from the mahogany desk, her old bones protesting, and walked over to stand beside him. They looked down at the lock. Unlike the front door, which had required brute force to destroy, this mechanism was clean, shielded from the elements for over 80 years. He knelt, using the tip of his pocket knife to clear a tiny speck of dust from the keyway. Remembering the fountain pen and the leather binder on the desk, she hurried back and searched the small drawers of the vanity. Hidden in a secret velvet-lined compartment at the back of the center drawer, her fingers brushed against a heavy, uniquely notched brass key. She brought it to him. He slid the key into the trapdoor lock. It fit with absolute fluid precision. With a heavy, satisfying mechanical clunk, the internal tumblers shifted, and the iron ring sprang upward an inch. He gripped the ring with both hands, bracing his boots against the floorboards, and pulled. The heavy hatch resisted for a second before swinging upward on counterweighted grease hinges that had somehow remained functional. A new draft of air rushed out, not the cedar and paper scent of the living room, but a cold, sterile wash of ozone, dried grease, and the unmistakable metallic tang of heavy machinery. He clicked on the heavy plastic flashlight, cast a reassuring glance up at her, and began his descent down a flight of solid, pristine concrete steps. She followed closely behind, her hand gripping his shoulder for balance, as they stepped out of the 1940s living room and into something entirely alien. The flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness of the underground space, revealing that this was absolutely not a root cellar for storing preserves. The walls were thick, poured-in-place military-grade concrete, completely devoid of moisture or dampness. As he swept the light across the expanse, the sheer scale of her grandfather's hidden life came into breathtaking focus. They were standing in a fully realized, state-of-the-art 1940s research laboratory and experimental workshop. Rows of green-painted steel workbenches stretched into the gloom, topped with complex, glass-tubed radio transmitters, heavy oscillators, and massive electrical transformers connected by thick, insulated copper wiring. Dust covered everything, but underneath the silver powder, the equipment was pristine, looking as though the technicians had just stepped away for a lunch break. Along the back wall stood a massive shortwave radio tower apparatus, its dials and frequency meters calibrated to military bands that hadn't been used since the fall of Berlin. She walked toward the primary workbench, her eyes wide with astonishment. Spreading across the surface were dozens of large, rolled-up blueprints drawn in deep Prussian blue and stark white lines. She carefully unrolled one, anchoring the corners with a pair of brass calipers. The technical drawings detailed complex schematics for advanced encryption devices and high-frequency communication arrays, technologies that looked decades ahead of anything publicly available in 1945. Stamped in bold, red ink across the top of every single page were the words, "Restricted, Manhattan District Project." He moved deeper into the shadows of the lab, his flashlight illuminating a row of heavy, olive-drab military surplus supply crates stacked against the concrete pillars. Each crate was secured with heavy padlocks and stenciled with government serial numbers. He used the crowbar to pry the lid off the nearest crate. The wood splintered, revealing rows of securely padded, custom-machined brass components and heavy, sealed lead canisters meant to shield sensitive materials. They had spent months running from city police, hiding from building managers, and begging for warmth on the concrete grates of a gentrified metropolis. Now, they were standing inside a literal fortress of lost history, surrounded by a physical legacy that was undeniably explosive. Her grandfather hadn't just fled to protect his family. He had constructed a subterranean stronghold to hide a cache of advanced wartime technology that the most powerful nations on Earth would have killed to possess. The stakes of their survival had just escalated from a simple search for shelter into the custody of a secret that changed everything they knew about the past. The cold, dense air of the concrete bunker seemed to vibrate with the sheer scale of the discovery. He kept his flashlight trained on the center of the laboratory, where a smaller, heavily reinforced steel vault sat, built directly into the bedrock foundation. Meanwhile, her attention remained anchored to a small glass-topped desk near the shortwave radio array. Resting there, entirely undisturbed by the passage of 8 decades, was a thick, leather-bound logbook. Unlike the emotional letters upstairs, this was a formal document, its pages dense with mathematical formulas, wiring diagrams, and precise dates. She turned to the very last entry, dated August 14, 1945, the exact day Japan announced its surrender, effectively ending World War II. Her eyes tracked the neat, rigid handwriting as the final, missing pieces of her grandfather's life fell into place. The journal entries revealed that he had been a lead researcher on a deeply clandestine project focused on alternative electromagnetic energy and advanced encryption. He hadn't just been building radios, he had successfully developed a method of high-frequency power distribution and uncrackable signal encryption that was decades ahead of its time. But as the war drew to its bloody close, he watched with growing horror as the geopolitical landscape fractured. He saw the dawning of the Cold War on the horizon and realized that his breakthroughs, if fallen into the wrong hands, would not be used to rebuild a broken world. They would be weaponized to destroy it. The final entry was written with a desperate, breathless urgency. He detailed how government intelligence operatives had begun tightening their grip around him, demanding his complete research files and preparing to relocate him to a secure, permanent military facility where he would lose all autonomy. Realizing the devastating potential of his creations, he made a final, terrifying choice. He chose defiance. In the dead of night, he scrubbed his primary laboratory in the city, packed his critical prototypes, and transported them to this remote mountain sanctuary. He sealed the cabin behind a legal and physical fortress, then vanished into the American heartland under a completely assumed identity. He intentionally left a trail of manufactured clues pointing toward Europe, drawing the relentless government agents away from his wife and young daughter, ensuring their safety by making himself a ghost. A heavy, metallic thud echoed through the basement, breaking her focus. He had finally managed to crack the primary latch on the central steel vault using the heavy crowbar and the custom brass key. The thick steel door swung open on perfectly balanced bearings, revealing the true substance of her grandfather's legacy. Inside the vault, there were no glittering bars of gold or bags of untraceable currency. To a desperate homeless family, what lay inside was infinitely more valuable. The shelves were lined with immaculate, state-of-the-art 1940s prototypes, devices encased in polished brass and heavy bakelite, preserved in airtight glass domes that had prevented even a speck of oxidation. Beside them lay complete, legally filed and stamped patent applications, registered under a private shell corporation her grandfather had established before the government could seize his intellectual property. These blueprints contained the foundational mathematics for technologies that modern telecommunications and green energy sectors were still trying to perfect in the 21st century. It was a goldmine of industrial and historical value, a collection of intellectual property worth millions to modern technological firms. But her grandfather was a practical man who understood that his descendants might need immediate, terrestrial salvation before they could ever leverage his scientific genius. Resting on the bottom shelf of the vault was a heavy steel lockbox. He brought it over to the workbench, forcing the lid open. Inside was a thick, tightly banded stack of vintage documents. He lifted the first set of papers, his eyes widening as he read the crisp, legal typography. They were fully authenticated, legally sound land deeds encompassing not just the cabin, but hundreds of acres of prime, timber-rich Appalachian land surrounding the property. Because of the unique, ironclad legal trust her grandfather had constructed in 1945, the land had remained entirely immune to state seizures, property taxes, or corporate buyouts for over 80 years. It was an unassailable kingdom of private property. Beneath the deeds lay the final piece of their salvation, a thick cache of emergency bearer bonds and historical treasury notes, completely valid and accumulated with decades of uncollected interest. He held the documents under the flashlight beam, his hands trembling violently. For months, his entire universe had been reduced to the price of a gallon of gasoline and the fear of being moved from a freezing parking lot. Now, the paper in his hands represented an ironclad shield of financial freedom. She walked over to him, resting her weathered hand over his trembling fingers. They looked at the treasure arrayed before them, a legacy not of abandonment or shame, but of unparalleled brilliance, foresight, and protective love. Her grandfather had anticipated the exact day the legal seal would expire, calculating that by the time his descendants opened this door, the political fires of his era would be ash, and his family would finally be safe to claim what he had suffered to preserve for them. They were no longer outcasts, sleeping in the shadows of a city that didn't want them. They were the keepers of a secret that would reshape their lives forever. The heavy iron hatch of the underground bunker remained open, but they ascended the concrete steps back into the main cabin, carrying the steel lockbox and the leather-bound logbook like sacred relics. Up here, the atmosphere had transformed. He had finally managed to clear a secondary ventilation draft in the hearth, and a roaring, crackling fire of seasoned oak now filled the room with a deep, amber glow and a wrapping, life-giving warmth. For the first time in countless months, the biting teeth of the winter wind could not reach them. They sat together on a heavy wool blanket spread before the fireplace, the ancient timber walls reflecting the dancing flames. They spent the remaining hours of the dark night turning the yellowed, brittle pages of the history that had been stolen from them. She read aloud in a low, reverent whisper, her voice steadying as she uncovered the depth of her grandfather's calculations. Every patent, every land deed, and every uncashed bond had been meticulously prepared to survive the legal shifts of the coming decades. He listened intently, his fingers tracing the embossed seals on the corporate documents. As the hours ticked toward the morning, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room. Not a silence of isolation, but of deep, emotional reclamation. She looked at her son, his face finally relaxed, the perpetual hypervigilance drained from his eyes by the warmth of the fire. The realization hit her then, striking her with the force of an physical wave. They were no longer forgotten. They were no longer the displaced ghosts haunting the edges of a gentrified city, begging for the bare minimum of human dignity. The narrative of their lives had been rewritten in a single night. They weren't running anymore. They had a fortress, a name, and an unassailable foundation beneath their feet. Her grandfather had reached across 81 years of silence to hand them their salvation. When the first pale light of the mountain dawn began to bleed through the front windows, illuminating the silver dust like dancing particles of gold, he stood up. The exhaustion of the journey was gone, replaced by a fierce, driving purpose. He carefully packed the most critical legal documents, the bearer bonds, and a selection of the primary encryption blueprints into the heavy manila envelope they had received from the legal aid attorney. He kissed her forehead, promising to return before the fire could burn down to ash, and stepped out into the crisp, morning air, the Volvo's engine catching on the first turn with a renewed, roaring vitality. His descent from the mountain was entirely different from the desperate climb of the previous day. He drove directly into the state capitol, bypassing the predatory payday lenders and local shelters, and walked straight into the offices of a highly reputable historical preservation society, followed by a consultation with a premier, specialized estate law firm that handled complex intellectual property trusts. When he laid the 1945 Manhattan District project blueprints, the pristine patent filings, and the unassailable land deeds across the mahogany conference table, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The attorneys and historians didn't see a desperate man from the streets. They saw the keys to a forgotten chapter of American scientific history. Over the next several days, the wheels of justice and historical validation turned with astonishing speed. Experts were dispatched to the mountain under strict confidentiality agreements, their eyes widening as they verified the underground laboratory and the pristine prototypes. The specialized firm initiated the legal process to claim the decades of accrued interest on the bearer bonds and formally activate the private land trust. Her grandfather's sacrifice was entirely vindicated. The Historical Society began preparing a massive, formal acknowledgement of his contributions to early encryption and energy science, correcting a decades-old narrative of desertion and replacing it with one of supreme patriotism and ethical brilliance. His intellectual property was finally recognized, ensuring that his name would be etched permanently into the annals of American innovation, and more importantly, that his remaining family would never have to worry about survival again. Months later, the harsh mountain winter had finally yielded to a breathtaking Appalachian spring. The dense, suffocating overgrowth that had once threatened to swallow the cabin whole had been carefully cleared away, revealing the magnificent, heavy timber skeleton of the original structure. The logs had been power-washed, treated, and sealed to a warm, honey-gold hue that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The rusted iron bars were gone, replaced by pristine, double-paned insulated windows that caught the reflection of the endless blue sky. The front porch had been completely rebuilt, its fresh pine boards sturdy and level, smelling of lacquer and new beginnings. She sat in a comfortable, high-backed rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a plush, heavy wool blanket. At 75, the lines on her face were no longer etched by the biting anxiety of survival, but by a deep, enduring serenity. She looked out over the vast, rolling ridges of the valley below, hundreds of acres of majestic timberland that were now completely, indisputably theirs. The inheritance had swiftly settled their financial anxieties. The historical treasury notes and bearer bonds had been liquidated into a trust that guaranteed them a life of absolute comfort and security for generations to come. Major technology corporations were already bidding for the rights to license her grandfather's encryption patents, ensuring an influx of generational wealth. Yet as she watched a hawk soar gracefully over the pine canopy, she knew that the money was merely a byproduct of their true fortune. The greatest gift her grandfather had left them wasn't the wealth, but the total, absolute restoration of their dignity. They were no longer the invisible casualties of a modern city, moving from shadow to escape the notice of authorities. They had a home, an honorable name, and a recognized place in history. The cloud of shame that had hung over her family for nearly a century had been permanently dispelled, replaced by the proud, vindicated legacy of a visionary who had chosen exile to keep them safe. The screen door creaked open smoothly on its new brass hinges, and the familiar, reassuring sound of her son's footsteps echoed across the porch. He walked out carrying 2 mugs of hot cider, steam rising into the crisp mountain air. The transformation in him was profound. The heavy, protective slouch he had carried on the streets was gone, replaced by an upright, confident posture. The exhausted, hypervigilance in his eyes had softened into a steady, calm resolve. He had spent the morning working with the historical preservation team, ensuring that the underground laboratory beneath the floorboards would be preserved exactly as it was. A private family museum dedicated to the genius who saved them. He handed her a mug and stepped up to the porch railing, standing tall beside her rocking chair. He rested his hand on the sturdy wooden post, his gaze sweeping over the thriving wilderness that surrounded their sanctuary. The battered old Volvo was gone, replaced by a reliable 4-wheel drive truck parked neatly in the gravel driveway. But the lessons of their struggle remained deeply woven into who they were. They would never forget the cold, but they would never have to fear it again. She reached out from beneath her blanket, her weathered, arthritic hand finding his strong, calloused wrist and giving it a gentle, loving squeeze. He looked down at her, a quiet, knowing smile gracing his features. Standing there on the threshold of their new life, looking toward a bright, unassailable future, a powerful sense of closure settled over them both. The grandfather who had once seemed like a ghost of abandonment had actually been their ultimate protector. He had looked 80 years into the future, anticipated their moment of greatest need, and built a fortress in the mountains to save them when the rest of the world had turned its back.